We want to move now to CBS News foreign correspondent Jonathan Vigliotti joining us from London with more on the international reaction to these strikes. Jonathan, the Pentagon said this was successful. The strikes hit their intended target. But how have leaders in the U.K. and France addressed the result of the strike? And do you see any noticeable differences in the response to this?
Yeah, Errol, I think the messaging here in the UK and in France has been, you could say, near identical to what we're hearing out of the US. Leaders from all three countries and officials who were very close to the planning and the carrying out of these airstrikes described it as a mission. They used the word used with restraint and precision. And we heard that word often mentioned during the Pentagon discussion that we just heard from. And that is really the united message here. We heard the Pentagon describe that this was carried out at 3 o'clock in the morning so that they knew civilians and other people wouldn't be around to try to limit the death toll there. We also heard a little bit more about kind of the implementation of this. And so when you talk about both France and the U.S. and the message here in the U.K., very strongly suggesting that this was one where restraint was used through and through.
The U.S., the U.K. and France all seem to be warning that they will not tolerate chemical weapon usage in Syria. What is the potential for additional strikes?
Yeah, there could be additional strikes, but only if the Syrian government continues to use chemical weapons. That was a warning that was issued early this morning by France's interior minister, who also said the strikes wiped out a significant amount of Assad's chemical stockpile. The U.S. has called this a one-off attack, but again, they also kept that very open-ended, very much dependent on how Assad and the regime in Syria handles and reacts to this attack.
And let's zoom in a little bit on the region. What is the reaction locally there in Syria and from its neighbor, Iraq?
Yeah, Syria and Syrian media, no surprise here, called the airstrikes a flagrant violation of international law. The Assad regime has repeatedly denied responsibility for the chemical attacks, even though all signs have pointed to the government. This morning, the government released rather bizarre video of President Assad walking casually to work with a briefcase in his hand, and what I guess you can describe as a show of strength this morning after these airstrikes.
We know that the UN held an emergency meeting on Friday. Russia is now calling for another meeting here in the next hour or so. What is the United Nations position and guidance on all of this?
Yeah, we come back to that word restraint. The UN has urged restraint. They are specifically concerned about an escalation of violence and destabilization in the region. And the UK and the US and France, as we've discussed, they have, almost anticipating that kind of reaction, gone out of their way to portray this mission as both narrow in its focus and also precise. The buildings that were targeted, we heard Prime Minister May this morning talk about them, as well as the Pentagon, saying that all of them had some sort of believed connection to the production of chemical agents. Again, also saying that there were no deaths, at least at this point. Prime Minister May going even further this morning, saying that we can't allow for the use of chemical weapons to be normalized. She called that usage barbaric.
Now, in a tweet, the Russian ambassador is saying these actions will not be left without consequences, but the military analysts we're speaking with say that Russia knows it would lose in a conventional war with the U.S. So what should we make of that threat of consequences coming from the Russians?
Yeah, he also said that a pre-designed scenario is being implemented, and what that means exactly at this point is still also unclear. But Russia does seem to want to keep military tensions from escalating further. The defense ministry made a point of saying that the cruise missiles never enter that so-called zone of responsibility. Vladimir Putin is seeking that emergency session of the UN Security Council. So obviously some discussion is still unfolding before any kind of action is even being considered.
All right, Jonathan Vigliotti joining us from our London bureau as we gather the response which is coming into us